The prosecution says Lindsay knew exactly what she was doing and knew it was wrong. The defense argues that she was suffering from severe postpartum mental illness. This was like, you could hear a pin drop. Everybody was like, what does she have to say? And she had a lot to say. Let's talk about the day that Patrick's own father took the stand. Hello, Sofa Squad, and welcome back to the sofa. This is the sofa that's in the title. My name's Paul if you're new here. If you're not new here, we like to switch things up with my name a little bit just to keep things fresh, okay? We're gonna go ahead and just call myself Carl today. Okay, Carl. I don't know why I thought of that, but that's what we're going with. Now, y'all, today we're going to continue talking about some of the updates that have taken place. This is like kind of over, say, days 6, 7, 8, 9, that type thing. Some of the highlights that really stuck out to me that I want to make commentary on. So go ahead and get your true crime blankie, fill your cup up with whatever it is you like, and let's dive in. First, let's get everybody on the same page if you're not completely familiar with this case. So for anybody who's just joining the sofa, here's the quick background on the Lindsay Clancy case. On January 24th, 2023, Lindsay Clancy was home in Duxbury, Massachusetts with her 3 children. There's a 5-year-old Cora, 3-year-old Dawson, and 8-month-old Callan. That evening, Lindsay sent her husband, Patrick, out to pick up medication and takeout. While he was gone, Lindsay strangled all 3 children with exercise bands in the basement of their home. She then would injure herself and eventually jump out of the 2nd-story window. Sadly, none of the children would make it. Lindsay would survive, but she would suffer spinal injuries that left her paralyzed. Now, the big issue in this trial isn't whether Lindsay took the life of her children. That's not disputed. The prosecution says Lindsay knew exactly what she was doing and knew it was wrong. The defense argues that she was suffering from severe postpartum mental illness and was not criminally responsible for her actions. So ultimately, this case comes down to Lindsay's state of mind at the time she took the lives of her children. And that's what we're seeing take place in the courtroom. Now, I'm filming this on Sunday, and so the day or tomorrow, the defense is going to cross-examine the psychiatrist, Jennifer Tufts, who treated Lindsay. So this is major testimony. We'll get into that as we keep going. As a side note, I'm going to record a separate video when the state questioned Dr. Jennifer Tufts, her timeline, and I'm going to compare it to the dates in the civil lawsuit of Lindsay's and what that alleges took place during those times, because there's a lot of discrepancies that I find very interesting. But of course, we know civil lawsuits, the bar is different. It's just their version, all that. But I think that it's really interesting. And then we'll see what happens when the defense cross-examines the doctor, and I'll probably do another video on that. But for now, let's talk about one of the first things that I want to get to, and that was when the nanny took the stand. This was like, you could hear a pin drop. Everybody was like, what does she have to say? And she had a lot to say. So the nanny's name is Elaine. She'd been a nanny for about 15 years and she lives in Kingston. Now, she started working for the Clancys after she responded to a Facebook post that Lindy made in July of 2022. Now, she would work for them roughly between like September through December of 2022. Now, her primary responsibility that she was brought on for was to take care of Callan. And this especially was when Lindsay returned to work. Now, her normal shift was like, say, 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Now, she would take care of Cora and Dawson and do things for them as well, right? And at least once or twice, she would talk about having all 3 children. Now, she would take Callan on walks. She took Cora and Dawson to tumble from gymnastics. And she would take videos of the kids, send them to Lindsay. And one of those was on September 9th, 2022. And there was a video of Callan drinking from a bottle. And they would play this for the jury. And Lindsay became very emotional when it was shown. Now, Elaine also described Lindsay as a wonderful mother. She testified that she believed Lindsay appreciated the work that she did. Now, also, a huge thing that would come out is that she did not have any concerns about Lindsay being around the kids. Now, Lindsay had discussed experiencing postpartum difficulties with the nanny, and she talked about, like, say, medications and needing to stop breastfeeding, stuff like that. But there was never anything that was huge, right? Nothing that was ever major that came out. Now, another thing that the nanny really established for me was, number one, she was like, they made some comment when the defense questioned her about, didn't you say you loved her or something like that? And she's like, I did, I loved Lindsay, of course, the children and whatnot. She still followed up with them. A huge thing that was going on in this trial leading up to this is the nanny had been let go. And it was like, why was she let go? Oh my gosh, she was a horrible person to work for, meaning Lindsay. She left these crazy lists. Well, what really took place was Lindsay was going to go back to work, was having issues and all this type of stuff, decided not to. And the nanny would say that Lindsay and Patrick went for a walk one day and basically discussed it and came back and were like, look, we can't swing it. Lindsay's going to be staying home. I'm home, meaning Patrick. So they're like, we're going to have to let you go. They gave her 2 weeks notice. It was nothing, that was like bad blood between them. She kept up with them afterwards. So there was not anything wild. Now, what they also did is they asked her about the list that Lindsay would leave. And it was like specific to sleep schedules, feed schedules, things of this nature. And the nanny said it was nothing out of the ordinary. It was pretty simple. She appreciated the list. It didn't make her think that Lindsay was, neurotic or anything of this nature. So as we've seen with so many of these witnesses, she described a pretty decent level of normalcy. She would come there sometimes, Lindsay would be working out in the basement, or she might be running around or whatever. There was just nothing out of the norm. So when the state would redirect, one thing that they brought out is that Lindsay never discussed self-harm, intrusive thoughts, any of this stuff. And now when we get into the timeline of the allegations made in the civil suit versus what Jennifer Tufts says, the doctor, this will be kind of a discrepancy. Now, so for speculation, would Lindsay tell the nanny, I'm hearing thoughts and thinking about harming myself? Probably not, right? Probably not. But a huge thing that the state wants to bring out with everybody is that there was a level of normalcy. Lindsay was oriented. She knew what was going on. She was making decisions. She was acting normal, and that will bring us to another day in trial. So let's talk about the day that Patrick's own father took the stand. So on day 7 or 8, I can't remember which one, it would be a full day of testimony that would begin with a medical examiner taking the stand. Now, this was very emotional. Lindsay would be honestly openly sobbing over there, okay? And I thought that they were going to take her out of the courtroom, but they got through the testimony and then they took a break and it took a while and they came back or whatever. So there was an entire day of witnesses such as former co-workers, friends, people who worked at the little daycare she took her kids to, people who worked at the gym daycare, all these type people. And we would have in there Patrick Clancy's father take the stand. So one of the things overall with everybody that was established is, again, this sense of normalcy. When I say established, I'm talking about by the state. Lindsay is oriented. She's making decisions. She's conversing. She's not saying she wants to do bad things. You really wouldn't know, okay? And then her former father-in-law was saying, yeah, we were there at Thanksgiving. And yes, she seemed maybe a little bit different at times, but it was nothing that, and he described, but it was like anybody would be. And he described a situation of one of the children doing something and, he got up and helped her. She seemed overwhelmed and whatnot. And that was maybe a common thing that I might hear from more than anything else was overwhelmed at times, that type situation. So I think one of the things with the state that they're trying to do again is just produce this level of normalcy, right? And almost in the context of she's making decisions, she's doing this, she's doing that. There aren't signs that are leading to the postpartum psychosis that she claims, took place in the moment or whatever it is, right? And so it was a day of that. And I think it's very powerful in certain ways to have, her husband testifying for her and his parents, or at least his father or whatever. We'll have to see how that plays out when these same people take the stand, because they are supposed to take the stand in Lindsay's defense when the defense presents their case. And we're probably very close to that. Now, I want to jump and fast forward to some of the main stuff that I saw that I was like, whoa, okay? We're going to talk specifically about 2 doctors, psychiatrists, whatnot. We'll talk first about Dr. Goodhart from the McLean Center, okay? Now, this is a medical center that Lindsay basically was checked into, okay? And we learn a lot about how that place probably runs. So let's talk about first, who is Dr. Alia Goodhart? So Dr. Alia Goodhart is a hospital psychiatrist, and she served on the prosecution's witness list. Now, her role at this hospital is she worked there for 5 years, and she was on the AB1 South inpatient unit. Now, she was involved in evaluating and treating Lindsay Clancy during her voluntary stay at McLean Hospital following her admission on New Year's Day. Now, one thing I want to point out is during cross-examination during this, she would acknowledge that she couldn't ever recall treating a patient with postpartum psychosis throughout her practice. She would say, yeah, I've seen, like, I couldn't even tell you how many postpartum situations, but she did not have specific experience with that. And the defense would bring this out, and I do think that's of note. Now, what I want to do is go through and kind of go through a few talking points about her, and then we'll go from there. So I want to jump to when the defense cross-examined this witness. So I'm just going to be very honest and just say this was some painful testimony. I'm not talking about emotionally. It was like pulling teeth, right? Now, one thing you have to remember is all these lawsuits are going on, okay? McLean Center is listed in there. This doctor's name is not specifically in there. That doesn't mean that it maybe couldn't be, I don't know. But Jennifer Tufts is. So this doctor was very careful with what she said, and there was a lot going on there. So let's just talk about a few of the key points that the defense pointed out in his cross-examination of her. So number one, a failure to retrieve outside records and consult prior providers. One thing you're going to want to remember is that Lindsay was seeing, Jennifer Tufts. She had a couple of different situations going on, right? So, and this is one thing where I'm curious how this will go in her civil suit because of her kind of being erratic with doctors and whatnot, but we'll see. But the defense really used this to their benefit. The defense would bring out that Dr. Goodhart nor the hospital staff requested HIPAA release forms to review records from Lindsay's prior outpatient providers. The argument that the defense would also bring out is that McLean and the doctors there, they just relied completely on Lindsay's self-reporting and that they shouldn't have done that. So then also the defense would bring up that like all sorts of testing wasn't done that should have been. They would say that the hospital didn't perform standardized psychological inventories such as MMPI or Beck inventory to detect symptom minimization or exaggeration. Now, they would also point out that the staff didn't administer the Edinburgh postnatal depression scale during her stay. They would also say that basic blood work was completed, but the hospital did not test blood levels for complex cocktails of prescribed meds, so like all the stuff that she was taking. Now, they say that also the staff in the hospital completely overlooked a lot of the symptoms and things that she was going through. So on the stand, Dr. Goodhart would admit that she was not aware that Lindsay had called a "I want to take myself out" hotline twice prior to coming to that hospital. Now, also, the defense would bring out that Lindsay experienced severe insomnia. We're talking like 2 days without sleep, that type thing, after her Zoloft dosage was increased. They would also say that Lindsay reported experiencing severe anxiety, brain fog, feeling like a zombie, all this type stuff. Her husband, Patrick, had voiced explicit concerns to hospital staff regarding the rapid rotation and heavy combination of psychiatric medications that she had been prescribed over the preceding months. Now, also, like I said earlier, the defense would bring out that the doctor really didn't have much experience with this specific thing of postpartum psychosis. The defense established that Dr. Goodhart had no memory of treating postpartum psychosis in her career. Also, the defense counsel questioned her on varying medical definitions for the postpartum window. So there basically is like different definitions, and one was 4 weeks versus the CDC's, which was 12 months. Now, also, finally, is also that hospital environment, the patient compliance, all that stuff that, Patrick voiced, and clearly now the defense is saying as well. So the defense would talk about the skeleton crew on New Year's Eve day. Basically, they're just sitting around doing nothing, meaning even the patients. Maybe that's how that works. I don't know, but this would be something that came out. Also, the defense would also note that Lindsay admitted herself voluntarily. She was cooperative, and immediately following discharge instructions, she went and booked an outpatient appointment with her psychiatrist within an hour of leaving. So now, on that note, let's go ahead and transition to the testimony, at least the state questioning testimony of Dr. Jennifer Tufts. So Dr. Tufts, remember, she is specifically named in the civil suit against her, okay? So the one that Lindsay and Patrick, they have separate ones, but she is in both of those, okay? So she takes the stand, right? This is a huge thing. I've been waiting for this. So her position is she's a licensed psychiatrist at Astra Mental Health. She's board certified and licensed since 2022. She got an MD from University of Vermont and did a residency at Boston Medical Center. Dr. Tufts is going to detail Clancy's psychiatric evaluation history, initial intake questionnaires, symptom of postpartum anxiety and depression. She would talk about like her hesitation towards psychiatric medications, and she would talk about the various trials of various prescription drugs and then all the mental status examinations. Lindsay would see her for 14 appointments between September 2022 and January 2023. Throughout her testimony, Dr. Tufts would emphasize that Clancy repeatedly denied having taking herself out intentions, taking other people out intentions, auditory and visual hallucinations, or thoughts of harming her children. She would also review the medications that were prescribed to Lindsay and why they were, as well as noting Lindsay's reactions that she reported to them. Now, these were things that stuck out to me in general about the testimony. Number one, she was very organized and prepared. Like, she came up there and she was like, she had this big bucket. She was like, yes, on day 4, she's this. She was appropriately dressed. She spoke appropriately. She did this appropriately. Honestly, the pages turning, I was like, it's like very ASMR to me, I'm not gonna lie. But she was very prepared and organized. Another thing that would come out is that Lindsay was aware of like the risk of medications, things of this nature, and also that she gave Lindsay lots of resources of, if you're having an issue, call this place. If this happens, do this. If that happens, so on and so forth. You can imagine why the state's bringing this testimony out for obvious reasons. Now, she would also talk about Lindsay seeing these other providers, because remember, the McLean Center is one of the places where she went, got prescribed a bunch of other stuff, then comes back over to Dr. Tufts, and Dr. Tufts is like, you really need to just settle on one person being your medication. Like, you either need to come see me and I do that, and like we work on that together, not bouncing around and doing that type thing, especially with the reactions that Lindsay was having. A couple of other things that, you know, stood out to me, like I said, very organized, all that type stuff and whatnot. And again, if you're looking at it through a couple of lenses of, there's a civil suit version of this and there's the criminal trial where we're at to decide, was she of her right mind when she did this? Of course, the state is going to want to really go in heavy with this, right? Because they're trying to show that she had all the fair warning, all the stuff was there. You know, she was making decisions, she was doing this, she was doing that, and more importantly, she wasn't reporting to Dr. Tufts that she's hearing stuff or having harmful thoughts or any of this stuff. In Lindsay's civil suit, she says that she's reporting this stuff, but not necessarily to Dr. Tufts. So maybe when Monday comes and we hear more from the defense's cross-examination, we'll learn why that is. Now, another thing that Dr. Tufts would talk about is she would list some of Lindsay's stuff as like insight, poor, things of that nature. I can't remember specifically. And she was doing these because Lindsay would almost come in there from the way the doctor described it and be like, well, I don't want to take medication. I don't want to do this. And so not being willing to maybe look at that dynamic of it. Lindsay struck me as a type person after listening to Dr. Tufts that almost like, I want to go an all natural type way, if that makes sense, right? Like, I don't want to be on a bunch of medications. Like, I don't want that. She did sound like she had a desire to be off of that stuff, but also was aware of like, I'm having major issues. And also, it really sounds like Lindsay, she was one of those type people that just, for lack of better terms, I could say had an allergic reaction to SSRIs and things of this nature, right? But it was like she kept getting them from places. That part was just odd to me. And that's like when you get into the civil suit and whatnot. To me, also what came out from the testimony is like Lindsay's extreme situation and problem with insomnia. Now that can make you just, oh, you know what I'm saying? And so a lot of the drugs she was taking, were directed at that, but none of that seemed to work. And so I'm literally like, how is she taking like all this stuff and it doesn't seem to help at all? Now, also the doctor would say that she did try and go like when I say natural, like I'm talking supplements and things of this nature, because Lindsay really didn't want to take other stuff, but then she got so desperate. And, you know, Lindsay's check-in to the hospital came about in a way where Lindsay was just like, Patrick, I can't do it. We have to go. Like, you know, it's just, I'm not doing well. And so she went and did that. And that's where she got all these meds or whatever, and then came back and made an appointment with Dr. Tufts. At which point she's like, look, if you're going to be going here and getting on this and doing here and doing that or whatever, you know, you need to just get one person doing this. And so it sounded like And I don't know if the word is desperation. I don't know if the word's manic. I don't know if it's erratic, but this going all over the place, just, from thing to thing, trying to get the right meds, trying to get help, okay, and not getting it, and also having severe adverse reactions to the meds she was taking. So I found that to be interesting. I'm curious how the defense will frame their argument about this, especially knowing what the civil suit says, because the civil suit paints a completely different picture of symptoms and things like that. Again, the standard is much lower for the civil suit. So I'm curious how this will pivot. I'm also curious what's going to come out in the terms of, and how the defense goes through it with all these doctors coordinating with each other, right? Because we know at one point, doctor or nurse, I can't remember if it's a nurse or Dr. Gelada, or nurse practitioner or something, didn't return a phone call and get back with somebody. And this is another person who treated her, I think at McLean. So it just sounds a lot like that. It sounds almost like there's a team of people doing stuff that she kind of bounced between that weren't on the same page, or that also were looking at it like, tough it out and just up the medicine because that should get rid of this symptom. Okay, I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't know how medications work. Now, let's jump on to a few of the interesting moments that have taken place. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about a Facebook post that was entered into evidence. And I'm going to put it on the screen here. You can see it's attachment parent name for littles. And it's Lindsay. This is May 2021. Hello, lovely parents. I'm looking for advice, solidarity, ideas, something, anything. I am truly finding my 19-month-old to be the most difficult human I've ever encountered. I mean that with all the love in my heart, but I honestly cannot make it through a day without getting so frustrated with him. He is not my first child, so not to compare because I know that every child is different, but just for background, this isn't my first rodeo. Every single thing with him is a battle, and it has been this way for a while, since he was maybe 8 months old. I really try to pick my battles and only do what's necessary, but I mean everything. Getting out of his crib in the morning and going downstairs, changing his diaper, getting him dressed, getting him in his seat to eat, getting him in the car seat, getting him out of the car seat, putting on his jacket and shoes to go outside, having him come inside when it's time, going to sleep for his nap and at night. He fights me every step of the way with all of these very normal daily activities. It constantly feels like I have to force him to do these things, which feels so wrong, but he is always fighting me and crying about doing these very normal things. So this came up, and you can imagine as to why it would come up for the state's purposes, right? Now, keep in mind, the state is wanting to show that this was intentional. She knew what she was doing. This was a mother who basically was just over it, right? Just exhausted, had some mental health issues going on, but she knew what she was doing. And so, of course, this adds into showing that she's more, how would you say it, overwhelmed and frustrated as opposed to mentally unwell, okay? Now, I think this can be interpreted in numerous ways. Number one is May 2021. I'm not reading anything myself in this that sounds abnormal, especially like coming to a group and looking to be seen and heard, and also clearly advised, right? That's the point of it, okay, of the post. But I'm not reading into it that's, I'm sick of this child, this, that, and the other. It just sounds like this child is a lot. Now, of course, the state's wanting to show that this is a reason, like, okay, she had this and one child's super extra and, just exhausting and blah, 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 blah. So we'll see, right? It didn't really go too far, in my opinion, as far as like, it didn't jump out in the courtroom. It wasn't this huge thing of like, we got a bombshell in here. Now let's talk about a couple of the other things that went on that made me kind of stop and think for a little bit. Okay, so there was a moment where the courtroom, there was a little bit of drama, shall we say. We're getting into a lot of sidebars, I like to call them that, and the defense got a little bit. When one of these, the judge, we came back from break and the judge was like calling a sidebar, and the defense attorney was like, I'm not coming up there. And he was like, he said something. The judge snaps at him and he's like, this isn't The Handmaid's Tale. I'm not, putting tape over her mouth. He's like, and we had a hot mic moment from the state where somebody said, get her out of here. And the state's like, I didn't say that. They had this look in her face and they all run up there.
And I think it's really... I don't want to go to the sidebar. I really don't want to go to the sidebar.
I need to know what you're going to talk about before...
I want to tell you that they got picked up on a hot mic saying, shut her up during the playing of that autopsy. This is not like Handmaid's Tale, so you're going to tape them up.
Listen, I'm not doing that at all.
Well, what they were talking about is the morning where the medical examiner took the stand and Lindsay up there crying. I think what it was, whether the state said it or whether somebody in the audience said it and it picked up on the mic, somebody said something to the effect of like, she needs to get her out of here or whatever. And it did look like they were working towards that way. So, but it was a dramatic type moment. Okay. Now there was another moment, and this is when court ended one day. And of course I was running errands, but I had to get called up from the sofa squad. And it was about evidence coming in and like expert testimony, this type thing, okay, where the state's wanting some things to not come in there. One of the things was the defense bringing in like a little 3D model of the house, and this gave us a little bit more insight into what each side is saying about the fall. Now, what would come out in this is that essentially there's this whole little scrummage of even the judge saying, what you have insinuated, this is to the state, is that the fall and that her attempts to take her own self out were essentially a setup, a stage, and the state's like, we never said that. We didn't, we don't mean that. And literally everybody's like, what? That's literally what you've been inferring this whole time. You're asking things like about how deep lacerations were, going out the window, doing this and that. Oh no, we didn't. We think that she tried to, but I mean, obviously she's here, and all this stuff. And it was interesting that the judge even said, I've inferred from what you're saying that you're insinuating this. And that's what I've done too. So I think it's a little bit slippery of the state to try and slide that in there. The whole thing about the window, and I very much want this defense to just put it to rest on some level, is how she went out the window. Okay, so the state's trying to argue, and apparently they're not now, is what they're saying, but I don't know where else you would go with this, that she hung out the window and basically slid down the house, right? And trying to make it set the stage, but wasn't maybe factoring in that the ground was frozen and it was a lot harder, right? The defense is essentially trying to say like she went out head first and had head trauma. And like, so it was really this intentional thing. So it's made each side go at each other about what Lindsay did to herself to almost defend it if it was real or not. And I guess my question is, and I've questioned this the whole time where I'm like, what about the window? Like why, okay, so if she went out this way or that way. Somebody in the comments said, well, she was staging it. Why wouldn't she just go lay outside the window and say I fell? And I'm like, I know, right? It doesn't make sense. And so, even with the wrist stuff, and I see a lot of people, she's a nurse, she would know to do this and that. I can't speak to that. I'm not sure. I'm not a nurse. The vibe that I get from her self-inflicted wounds is that she did something. Now, remember this, she is claiming she heard these voices, a command hallucination that told her to take the lives of the children and then herself. Okay, so whether you're like, that's what she was doing, regardless if it was that or oh my God, what did I just do? I can't live with myself. Let me take my life. Like, whichever way it goes, okay? Her human instinct took over, in my opinion. And that's where it was like, I can't do it. I think she crushed the pills up. I don't know how that works. I would figure that if you crush them up, it would be a faster effect. I could be wrong. That was going to take too long. She grabs the knife. She does this. That didn't work. She did some pretty decent cuts on herself. And then, okay, well, let me just go out the window. And maybe she somersaulted over. Maybe she slid down. I don't know. But she ended up paralyzed, right? I don't think that it was like a let me set the scene type situation. I think that just, I don't know what you call it, biology took over, instincts, and she just couldn't go through with it. However, again, we're still very fresh in the trial. We haven't heard the defense's side of it, and soon we'll have more information to make a truly educated opinion on all that. Now let's go to another interesting thing that took place, and that is a former trial and conviction that got overturned during the middle of this, and this judge and DA were the ones on that case too. So let's talk about the case of Commonwealth versus LaTarsha Sanders. Just this week, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court overturned the murder convictions of LaTarsha Sanders. Now, this was another mother who was accused of killing her children and was convicted on that. And it was overseen by the same judge and prosecuted by the same DA's office that is doing Lindsay Clancy's case. Now, Sanders was convicted in 2022. She killed her 2 young sons. This is very similar to Lindsay Clancy. It wasn't a matter of like, if she did it, it was more about her mental state at the time. So Sanders had really severe psychiatric issues, and she would eventually go on to get diagnosed with conditions that were on the schizophrenia spectrum. But during her trial, the Judge Sullivan, so Lindsay's judge, prevented the defense team from introducing significant portions of her post-arrest psychiatric records as evidence. And now the Supreme Court of Mass is like, oh, hey, no, that was a judicial error, a prejudicial error, I should say. They're like, the jury needed to know that information. So this would lead to these convictions vacated. She gets a new trial. So you can only imagine that that judge is like, we're dotting I's and we're crossing T's. All right. Every witness comes in. Every evidence comes in, right? And he was a little saucy. That was the day after, the day of, whatever it was, that was when he got in that little tiff with the defense. And he was like, this isn't a Handmaid's Tale. I'm not going to put tape over Lindsay's mouth. You know, so the judge didn't say the defense of that. But he was a little bit saucy. We'll see, right? But that's huge. I mean, even just reading a little bit about LaSharda's case, I'm just like, why wouldn't you allow that? It's like a mental health case. So on that note, let's just kind of round out with some thoughts here. So it's so fascinating to continue on with the Miss Sanders case and in general, mental health and whatnot. One thing that's fascinating about this case is what it has brought or tried to bring to the forefront, I should say, a discussion, right, on how mental health is treated, this and the other. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the conversation has gone to left field stuff about all sorts of other stuff going on in the case, okay, that other people have done this and there's all this going on or whatever. So one of the things that started off though as a conversation with this was mental health, women's mental health, how women are treated in, you know, a doctor's setting, especially mental health things. And this specifically obviously is about Lindsay and postpartum and all this, but mental health in general and how that's treated here in the States and whatnot. And we're really seeing a lot of cracks in the system, I guess you could say. And I think that discussion needs to be had because I think it's treated very differently here than versus elsewhere, you know, but of course I don't have any kind of personal experience in other countries with that, right? So I can't speak fully on that, but it's just my perception of it. And so I think situations like having that other case overturned, seeing what's coming up with Lindsay's stuff, it's going to be a monumental case, whatever happens. I've talked to so many different people from so many walks of life, whether it's comment sections, people I know in real life, about this case, about postpartum issues, about specifically Lindsay and all this. You know, at this point, I could see this being a hung jury because if I apply what I'm seeing in real world comments and thought processes on it, as well as comment sections, and apply it to that jury, like if the jury is representing this, I don't see how they would come to a unanimous decision, right? Now, of course, we're still early in the trial. We haven't even gotten to the defense's case. You know, one thing I'm seeing, and again, I can't speak for the defense so far, but the state is going over and over and over, establishing she was of sound mind, basically. She's making decisions. She's doing this. There's nothing out of the ordinary. But what I wanted to see is something to congeal that all together, right? And then we'll move on to the defense and see what they say. So what do you think so far? Where do you stand? Do you think guilty, not guilty by reason of insanity, hung jury? What are your thought processes on it? I want to know in the comment section. While you are down there, if you could drop off some sofas for myself, Roscoe, that's the wrong pillow, Roscoe in spirit, there's my boy, Bo and Luke, who are sleeping and shockingly very quiet for this video. I'm very surprised. I'm sure there will be hell to pay the rest of the day when they are zooming all over the house being cute little Yorkies. But also drop some sofas off for you, the Sofa Squad, the most important because you make the sofa possible. It would not be here without you, and I'm greatly appreciative of it. Now, until we gather on that sofa in the comment section to talk about all the stuff we talk about, I'll see y'all soon.